It's time to learn our second essential stroke style called the multiple bounce or the bounce stroke. We've learned so far one stroke style, which is the rebound stroke, where we start here, hit the drum and allow the stick to bounce back up. Next stroke is where we push the stick into the drum head to produce multiple strokes. So the multiple bounce will essentially look like this. So I'm doing one stroke and creating multiple sounds. Now, if you've ever heard a buzz roll on a snare drum, you know exactly the kind of sound that the multiple bounce will produce. Let me show you what it's going to look like when we're all finished and done with this. Okay, we've all heard buzz rolls before on the snare drum, and in fact this is so important that it's actually our next rudiment. This is rudiment number 4 on our chart, called the buzz roll. The reason why we call it a buzz roll is because that's what it should sound like. Buzz, one nice long sound. Now the reason why I start this process so early is because I think it's very important that you learn how to produce great sounding multiple bounces on each hand separately before we put it all together. So this takes a long time and it's a long process. So let's begin by learning how to do great sounding buzzes on each hand separately. The concept that we're going to try to do here is pushing the stick onto the drum head using a little bit of pressure in our fulcrum to start the stick bouncing. Now as the stick bounces, I kind of release my pressure in my fulcrum to keep the stick bouncing. Watch that again. Now there's a couple important concepts that you should know. In producing a multiple bounce, the speed of my bounces is regulated by the squeeze I have, or the pressure I have in my fulcrum. I hate to use the word squeeze because really it's just a little bit of pressure. So if I put a lot of pressure in my fulcrum, I'll have a short bounce and it'll be very close together. If I have almost no pressure in my fulcrum, guess what happens? It rebounds back up. All right, the trick is to regulate the pressure in our fulcrum to produce that perfect sounding multiple bounce every single time. Now notice that I'm not turning loose of my fulcrum while I'm bouncing. I'm not sticking my fingers out. Okay, this is another common problem that students have, is that they'll squeeze the stick with the back fingers. See this all the time. If your bounce stops and you can't get it to go longer, even if your fulcrum is all the way off the stick, basically that means you're squeezing with the back fingers. That has been a no-no since day one. We have never squeezed the stick with those back fingers. So what I have sometimes with students that have a problem with this, I have them take the back fingers off altogether. Now we only do that just so that they can feel what it feels like to have that fulcrum pressure. We're not going to play the drum like this, and don't continue to do that other than a couple of times. Wrap the back fingers around, keep some space between the palm of the hand and the fingers so that you can regulate it with only the fulcrum. Of course, the multiple bounce is produced exactly the same way in the left hand. So your assignment before we stop this video and you go practice is to spend a couple of days, maybe several days, kind of depends on how long it takes, to produce great sounding multiple bounces on the right and the left hand separately. I instruct my students to set their metronome on 60 beats a minute to keep them from wanting to rush and get faster, so to where you're playing perfect multiple bounces on the right hand for a full minute and on the left hand for a full minute. Okay? That's your assignment for at least 2 days. It might even take longer. Sometimes I've spent a week or maybe even 2 weeks in my percussion class learning the multiple bounce on each hand separately before we begin to put it together. Stop the video, go practice. All right, once you've developed that perfect technique on each hand separately, it's time to put the hands together. Again, you've got to have that perfect technique on each hand, otherwise you're going to have some lopsided sounding buzz rolls. Here's how that will look. Notice that there's no gaps in sound. I'm not stopping the buzz from the beginning of one hand to the beginning of the other. Not this. I want to make sure that the buzz bleeds into the beginning of the next one. Actually, they overlap, so there's never any gaps in sound between one hand to the next. Also notice that I'm not doing anything different in my hands that I did with my rebound strokes and every other thing that we've worked on. Not squeezing with the back fingers, not turning loose of the thumbs, not pumping with the forearms. Everything looks exactly the same, playing nice wrist strokes and making perfect sounded multiple bounces. Eventually, we're going to speed that up. After you've done 60 beats a minute for a couple of days on multiple bounces alternating, then dial your metronome up to 80 beats a minute. Okay, once you've been able to do successful multiple bounces, then you're ready for the multiple bounce lines on lesson 2. Don't rush the process though. Make sure you take the amount of time that's necessary to do it correctly, and eventually you'll have great sounding multiple bounces. On our next technique exercise that we're going to work on is another essential stroke style called the downstroke.